Well, hey, if I haven't met you before, my name is Brian. I'm on I'm on staff here at Lake Springs. And this week I did something that I haven't done in a very, very, very long time. And that was this week I decided to go to the eye doctor. Now, let me tell you, last time I went to the eye doctor, I'm guessing was 15, 20 years ago. It was before we were married. That's about all I remember, and it was a while back. And I remember that I went. They said, your vision is just fine. Got nothing to worry about. And so I didn't worry about it ever again. And I have clung to this fact, so I thought in my mind, of having perfect vision. And I have leaned on it heavily. And when there's any debates about like what color something is or what something, anything, we can talk about it, but I have perfect vision. Like, there's not really a debate here. It's the doctor said I'm right. And so when things come up like that, you know, that like meme that went around ago of like, is this dress black and blue or gold and white or something like that? Like, it's funny to talk about, but it like is black and blue. Like there was not anything to debate, and I know that because the doctor said I was right, and that's all there is to talk about. But lately, I've felt the effects of aging, maybe, and I've noticed that things are getting blurrier. And I have to like focus more to see what I'm trying to see. And especially like driving at night has gotten more difficult, where light affects my eyes a lot more, and I'm squinting while driving at night. And that just doesn't seem safe or the thing that you should be doing when it's low light. And so I decided to go see the doctor, the eye doctor. And I went and told him my symptoms, got checked out, and he came back saying, well, your vision's just fine. You got nothing to worry about. He's like, I can give you glasses, but it's gonna be a waste of money. You don't need them. I was like, well, but what about the fact that it's really hard to drive at night? Is there anything you can do about there? And he said, well, you can rest assured that you see better than 99% of the people you're driving past. Like, that offered me no comfort at all because I feel like I can't see anything. And so I don't know if I believe him or trust him. I may be going to a different eye doctor to get a second opinion at some point. But it made me think of a few years back, a handful of years ago, taking my wife to go to the eye doctor and to update her prescription. She's worn glasses for a long time, and she had glasses that were old. I don't know how glasses work. I don't know anything. And so we took her at some point to go and get an updated prescription. And we went. She got the eye exam, got new glasses, and when we went back to pick them up, she got them, put them on. We went outside, and it was like someone seeing in color for the first time. It was like her walking outside was just like it was like Aladdin's A Whole New World should have been playing, and it was just everything is great again. And she's walking across the parking lot, and I remember her being like, "Look at that sign over there. Like, can you read that? I can read that." And I'm like, "Yeah, everyone can read that." Like, it's concerning that you drove us here and couldn't read that, but I remember her looking around and looking at everything, just amazed at this whole new world. And then she looks at me and kind of gives me a double take, and then looks at me. And she, I kid you not, looks at me and says, have you always had freckles? Now, we've been together at this point for like 20 years. Like, we got together in middle school. And so I don't know who she thought she fell in love with, but she got a dose of reality that day. And we've been together ever since, so it wasn't terribly bad. But all I could think about this week is I was, these past few weeks as I was reading what we're going to be studying today and looking through it is this story, because it really kind of brought to mind this question for me, and that's, do we see God for who he really is? That's what we're going to be asking today. Do we see God for who he really is? Or the God that we see, or the God that we kind of envision in our mind, is he just kind of a creation that we made based on what we want God to be or what we think God should be? Or is it actually rooted in Scripture and rooted in reality of who God really is? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So if you got a Bible, you can go ahead and open up. We're going to be in Mark chapter 12. If you don't have a Bible with you, there's a blue one in one of the seat backs underneath the seat in front of you. And the page number for that blue Bible is on the screen. And we've also been giving out these Mark scripture journals, and the page number for those scripture journals is on the screen as well. But kind of what we're doing, if you're new with us today or if you've missed the past few weeks, what we're doing for these next, these like 4 months that start this year, is we are spending 4 months talking about the last week of Jesus' life. Where typically what we'll do in a church is we'll have, on Easter Sunday, we'll talk about Jesus' resurrection, which is wonderful. On Good Friday, a couple days before, we'll talk about Jesus' death. And then the week before, oftentimes we'll celebrate Palm Sunday, which is what happened a week before he died as he entered into Jerusalem. And we'll celebrate those days, which is really great. But there's a whole lot of stuff that happens in that week that sometimes we skip over. And so what we did is the first week of the year, we celebrated Palm Sunday. And January 1st was our Palm Sunday. And now we're going to spend the next 4 months talking about these 7 days, this 1 week, until we get to Easter, where we will celebrate Easter. And so kind of the story so far of where we're at in this week is Jesus entered into Jerusalem. He came in, they sang Hosanna, laid down palm branches and so forth. But he entered kind of as a king, but not in the way that people would expect a king to enter. He, instead of entering the city on like a royal horse or anything like that, he entered on a lowly donkey, which signified the lowly nature of his ministry. And then he goes and he goes to get a fig from a fig tree, but it's not fig season, so he curses the fig tree, which was a really bizarre thing to do. And then he goes and he cleanses the temple, drives out the money changers, and then we get an idea after that of why he cursed the fig tree, and it started to make a little bit more sense. And then last week we talked about Jesus being kind of challenged about whose authority is he teaching under and whose authority is he performing these works under. And he kind of turns this question back on these religious leaders and says, well, if you ask me that, I'm going to ask you, whose authority was John the Baptist teaching under? And they know that no matter how they answer, he kind of has them trapped, and so they don't answer, and he basically tells them, well, if you're not going to answer me, I'm not going to answer you. And what are you going to do about that? And that's where we left off last week. And then this week, today, jumping into Mark 12, is just a continuation of that same conversation. So this isn't weeks later, days later. This is just a continuation of last week. We saw that he's about to enter the temple, so this is most likely like on the steps of the temple, addressing a bunch of people that are around. And that's where we're going to pick up in verse 1 of chapter 12. And it starts with this, starting in verse 1. It says, and he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard and put a fence around it and dug a pit for a winepress and built a tower and leased it to tenants and went into another country. So Jesus is continuing to teach in a parable, which is kind of like a story that's illustrating an idea. And he's giving us the example of a landowner that has built a vineyard and leased it to tenants. And this is a typical situation that they would experience, where a landowner would build a vineyard and then hire people to come and live on it so he could go off, and then they would end up basically splitting the profits or splitting the fruit from the vineyard. And so, typical situation that they would see. And continuing in verse 2. When the season came, he sent a servant to the tenants to get from them some of the fruit of the vineyard. And they took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Again, he sent to them another servant, and they struck him on the head and treated him shamefully. And he sent another, and him they killed. And so with many others. Some they beat, and some they killed. So what we have here is we have a vineyard owner doing what anyone would expect a vineyard owner to do. That he's sending servants to go and collect some of the fruit, but instead of holding up to their end of the deal, these tenants are just beating the servants, sending them away, or even killing them. But he keeps sending servant after servant to go and collect what is rightfully his. And after they continually do the same thing over and over, he has one final solution to try and get these people to do what they're supposed to do. And we see that in the next verse. Verse 6. He had still one other, a beloved son. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, they will respect my son. So the landowner, in one final effort, sends his son. It says that he sent his beloved son, which is another way of saying sent his only son, to go and to try and hoping that they'll respect him, even though they've done nothing to show that that's the case. They've done nothing to show that they are going to treat him any differently than they treat the servants that were sent his way. And wouldn't you know it, they respond in the exact way that you would expect them to respond, in verse 7. But those tenants said to one another, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. And they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. So, surprise, surprise, they do exactly what you would expect them to do, exactly what their track record has showed, that they killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. And it's funny because the interesting thing here is that no ancient landowner would be this benevolent to these tenants. After maybe the first few attempts, he would have hired people or gathered people to go and drive them out or kill them himself. Like there's no reason for him to continue sending people. In fact, the people that were hearing Jesus give this parable, they most likely would have thought of this landowner as naive or dumb almost. Like, why would you do this? This is a ridiculous idea to keep sending them and then to send your son to go to the exact same fate as the others have experienced. And let me tell you, before we continue in this is a type of mercy and patience that I just cannot relate with. You know, I have a beloved son. I have an only son. He's 5. Obviously, I'm not sending him to be involved in business situations at this point. But even when he's grown, if there's any track record of danger or even a loss of life, I'm not volunteering him to go. Like, duh, of course. Nobody would. But this is what Jesus is telling them. This is what the landowner did. And what Jesus is doing here is he's telling people of the history of Israel. Essentially is what he's telling them. He's telling them just of the history of their people. That God built this nation of Israel, handed it over to his people, however, they continually turned away from him. And he continued to send prophets, continued to send messengers to them to guide them back to Jesus, or guide them back to God. And they continually ignored and even killed the prophets that were sent their way. And so, what did God do? Well, he did what the landowner did. He then sent his son. He then sent Jesus, his beloved son, to these people, knowing full well how they would respond, knowing full well that they'd treat him the same way. In fact, Jesus is giving this parable knowing full well that in just a couple days' time, he's about to be arrested and killed. And you see, verse 8 that we read, it tells us that after killing the son, they threw his body out of the vineyard. Now, we might just kind of blow past this statement. It seems like they killed him, they threw him out, whatever. But what we need to remember is this is a completely different culture than ours is today. And this is a culture that's based on honor and shame. And to not bury a body is kind of the final act, the final way that you could shame somebody after they're dead. You bury bodies. But to not bury someone is to heap even more disrespect and heap even more shame on them after their death. And so they're saying that this is what the tenants did to the son by casting him out, and this is what's about to happen to Jesus. See, what we're going to find out is in just a few days' time, Jesus is going to be led out of Jerusalem, out of the vineyard, to his own death. And what should happen to Jesus, what would have happened to Jesus, is after he is killed, taken down from the cross, is to not be given a proper burial. Now, we often hear, and I think Derek even talked about this a little bit before, but we often hear about the 3 that were crucified, the 2 that were crucified next to Jesus, and the Bible tells us that they're thieves or criminals that are crucified next to him. Now, I don't know about you, but growing up hearing this, I always thought, like, man, this seems like, this is a little, I know it's Rome, but like, this is a little extreme. Like, to crucify a couple thieves seems crazy. But the reality is that the reason that they were crucified is because in some way, shape, or form, they were showing that they wanted to rebel against Rome. And so to crucify them during Passover, which is the time when all the Jews were coming, all the Jews were migrating to this area, to kill them in such a public way, in such a humiliating way, was Rome's way of saying, this is what happens if you come up against us. And so Jesus is crucified right in between these 2 criminals. And what they would do after they crucify him is they do not take him down to give him a proper burial. They're already out of the city. They take him down and they throw him out. They let him rot, let the animals have their way with them, and the final way to shame them, and the final way to show disrespect to these people. And that's what should have happened to Jesus, if it were not for 2 men that we will learn about, named Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, who had become kind of secret followers of Jesus that asked for his body to give him a proper burial. So Jesus is telling us this parable about what's about to happen to him, that he knows what's coming, he knows what's about to happen to him. And this is what God's chosen people did to his prophets and what they're about to do to his son. And so if we keep reading in verse 9, we see what happens next. After they kill him, they throw him out of the vineyard. It says, what will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. Have you not read the scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. So we see Jesus tell the religious leaders that the vineyard, or the church, you could think of it, is about to be given to someone else. That we know that after Jesus dies, that the apostles are the ones who are in charge of the furthering of the church, and even the furthering of the church into Gentile regions, and even bring Gentiles in to lead the church. And so what he's telling them is like, hey, this is about to be taken from you. You have shown for generations and generations that you were more than comfortable going against God, that you are not going to be led, that nothing's going to lead you to him, and so God is about to take this away from you. And then Jesus quotes from Psalm 118 as he talks about the stone that has been rejected has become the cornerstone. And this is the same psalm that the people were proclaiming as Jesus entered Jerusalem, as they sang, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. This is the same psalm that Jesus is now quoting, talking about the stone that the builders rejected. He's talking about himself. The stone that was rejected will become the cornerstone, or in other words, will become the most important stone in the building of the temple, will become the most important stone that everything hinges on, that holds everything together, that holds our faith together, that holds our lives together, it holds everything together, and this stone is Jesus. And this stone is Jesus. And he concludes this parable, or after he concludes this parable, we see the response from the religious leaders in verse 12. It says, and they were seeking to arrest him, but feared the people, for they perceived that he had told this parable against them, so they left him and went away. Which is, to me, just a hilariously ironic verse, because basically he's saying they figured out that he's talking about them and wanting to kill him, and so because they figured out it was them, then they decided to plot to kill him. Like, I don't know what they're missing here. But they saw that the people would come up against them if they tried to arrest him, so they go off and plot his arrest and plot how they're going to kind of catch him and kill him in the future. And that's the end of the parable. And so what do we do with this? This is a parable that's pretty clearly about Israel, pretty clearly about the past generations and about how they've rejected God. But what do we now, today, do with this? Is this just a interesting kind of history lesson, or is there something that we can really pull from this to learn from? Earlier I asked if we see God for who he really is, and I think one aspect that we see from God, particularly in this story, but really throughout the entire Bible, and it's an attribute of God that I think we often miss. And there's a lot of attributes of God that I don't think we fully understand. Well, that I know we don't fully understand, but that we're pretty comfortable accepting. That God is powerful. I don't have any idea the scope of his power, but I know God is powerful. God is loving. I may have times where I don't understand that, or I don't live in that way to acknowledge that, but it's pretty easy to say God is loving. But one attribute that I think that we would say that we know, but we often forget, is that we worship a very, very, very patient God. In fact, I would go so far as to say that God is more patient than we could ever deserve or understand. God is more patient than we could ever deserve, but more patient than we could ever even comprehend. And honestly, I believe that the entire Bible is one long, gigantic story, all about God's patience. Everything falls under the heading of God's patience. If God was not patient with humanity, nothing in the Bible would be happening. But he is a patient God, not just with Israel, but with humanity and with you and with me. In fact, I don't know about you, if you've heard this before or if you've thought this before, but as we look at stories throughout the Old Testament, you may have thought this before, that Old Testament God is a mean God. Right? Old Testament God is harsh, and Old Testament God is extreme, vengeful, and you don't want to mess with Old Testament God. You want New Testament God. New Testament God is loving. Old Testament God is like you will be smoten, not smitten. You will be smote with God. But I would say, and I've thought this before, and so I understand that. And I want to be honest, especially if you've never read it before, there are some extreme stories in the Old Testament. But if you have that thought of God, of Old Testament God, that he's just harsh and mean, then I want to address that, because there's a couple realities. If that's how you truly feel about Old Testament God, then that is how you truly feel about current day God. Because if there's one thing we know about God, is that he does not change. He is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So if we view Old Testament God this way, then we have to view current day God this way. But I would also say, and I say this with the most love and the most non-judgmental way possible, that if that's the way you view Old Testament God, my guess is that you probably haven't spent a whole lot of time in the Old Testament. That most likely we're pulling from a few stories that are really intense, that are really severe, seem really severe. But if we look at the whole picture, the whole story, I see a God that is ridiculously patient with people who do absolutely nothing to deserve it. In fact, right now, in kind of my devotion time, I'm reading the book of Judges. And if you've never read the book of Judges is hilarious. It's awful. Like, there are parts of it that are really awful and that are really not hilarious. But the overall story is like, it's hard not to laugh at, because over and over, it's just this ridiculous cycle that you read it and you're like, this can't be true. This is ridiculous to read it this way. Over and over and over again, we get this phrase that the people the people again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Over and over again. We see them do evil, them getting handed over to the hands of their enemies, them crying out to God, God delivering them, and then the people again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And then he hands them over to the hands of their enemies, and then they cry out to God again, and then he delivers them, and then the people again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And it's just this over and over, where you're reading it and you're like, nope, this is, nobody acts like this. Like, this is ridiculous. And I don't know about you, but I think that if I was reading the story of my own life, it probably wouldn't look terribly different. That when it's all put into a couple pages, it seems silly, but if I look at the story of my own life, I don't think that things would look all that different. In fact, we kind of see this whole story of Israel summarized really well in the book of Nehemiah. And I'm going to read from a handful of verses there. You can turn there into the Bibles if you'd like, but they'll be on the screen, and it's going to be a big chunk that I read from. But what we see in the book of Nehemiah, or the story in both Ezra and Nehemiah, these are two books in the Old Testament, but originally they're written as one book of just Ezra and Nehemiah. And we see the Israelites kind of coming back from exile. We see the rebuilding of the temple. We see the rebuilding of the wall. And this whole time is kind of an effort to get people to turn back to God, to stop living their own way, to live and to start living for God, to honor their covenant. And it all kind of culminates in Nehemiah chapter 9, where we have this kind of public covenant made with God and this public confession of sin. And it's this long speech, and it's all the people gathered, this long speech about the faithfulness of God, how much he's been faithful to them throughout the generations, and how much they've turned their back on him. And I want to read this for you, because I find this really interesting to put in perspective about Old Testament God, but also not just to give us a history lesson of, oh, isn't this so interesting, but to read this in light of our own lives. And as you're reading this, think about your own life, and think about my life, and if our lives would really look terribly different if they were all boiled down to just these few pages. So Nehemiah chapter 9, starting in verse 16. Before this verse, they're praising God for his faithfulness, praising God for delivering them. And then we get to verse 16, and it says this: "But they and our fathers acted presumptuously and did not obey your commandments. They refused to obey and were not mindful of the wonders that you performed among them. But they stiffened their neck and appointed a leader to return to their slavery in Egypt. But you are a God ready to forgive, gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and did not forsake them. Even when they made for themselves a golden calf and said, 'This is your God, who brought you out of Egypt,' and had committed great blasphemies. After God delivered them from Egypt, then they, 30 minutes later, it seems, built a calf. And it was like, this God did it. And you read this and you're like, this is so ridiculous. But this is what they're confessing. This is the sin that they're confessing. You in your great mercies did not forsake them in the wilderness. The pillar of cloud led them in the way. The pillar of cloud to lead them in the way did not depart from them by day, nor the pillar of fire by night to light for them the way by which they should go. You gave your good spirit to instruct them, and did not withhold your manna from their mouth, and gave them water for their thirst. 40 years you sustained them in the wilderness, and they lacked nothing. Their clothes did not wear out, and their feet did not swell." Then he continues to talk about how he's been there for them in battle, that he helped them conquer, that they were able to overcome their enemies because of the power of God. And then we pick up in verse 26. "Nevertheless, they were disobedient and rebelled against you and cast your law behind their back and killed your prophets, who had warned them in order to turn back to you. And they committed great blasphemies. Therefore you gave them into the hand of their enemies, who made them suffer. And in the time of their suffering they cried out to you, and you heard them from heaven. And according to your great mercies you gave them saviors, who saved them from the hand of their enemies. But after they had rest, they did evil before you, and you abandoned them to the hand of their enemies, so they had dominion over them. Yet when they turned and cried to you, you heard them from heaven, and many times you delivered them according to your mercies. And you warned them in order to turn them back to your law. Yet they acted presumptuously and did not obey your commandments, but sinned against your rules, which if a person does them, he shall live by them. And they turned a stubborn shoulder and stiffened their neck and would not obey. Many years you bore with them and warned them by your Spirit through your prophets. Yet they would not give ear. Therefore you gave them into the hand of the peoples of the lands. Nevertheless, in your great mercies you did not make an end of them or forsake them, for you are a gracious and merciful God. And before we read this and think, oh good, they got it together, it's all settled now, that's just, now they know the path forward. If we keep reading, in just a couple chapters, we'll see Nehemiah go out into the people and see that they've all abandoned the covenant again, that they're all going against what they said that they would do. And he kind of goes crazy and runs around and starts beating people up and ripping their hair out and trying to force them back to God. And the book ends basically by him just crying out to God, saying, like, I tried. Spare me, please. Like, I did my best. They're not going to listen to me. I don't know what to do with this. But we can read this, and it seems like, man, these people just don't know what they're doing. They just can't get it together. They just keep turning away from God. He keeps showing up for them in very obvious ways, but they just keep turning away and keep doing their own thing. But like I said, if I were to read a story recapping my own life, I don't think it would look much different. You know, as I was thinking back, and as I was thinking about how it wouldn't look much different, it was pretty depressing to think about, to be honest, when you try and sum it all up. Because I think back to, like, my teenage years, and I had a hard time as a teenager. Most of my challenges were pretty self-inflicted, to be honest, but I had a hard go of it. I had a hard time. And I remember just crying out to God, being like, God, just help me find a way through this. Help things just to be normal, like they are for everyone else, and just help make a way through this. And then he does, and things got a little better. And I kind of went my own way. And then got a little older, and God, there's this girl I really want to marry, but I'm super nervous, and I don't know how this is going to happen, and so God, please provide a way, and wouldn't you know it, he sure did. And, all right, thanks, God, see you later. And then a few years later, you know, one of the things I always had in my mind as like an impossibility was moving out of Michigan. I grew up there. Oh, I don't mean that in a negative way. I love Michigan, but like I grew up in, I had never lived outside of like 20 minutes from the house I grew up in, and lived in that same house my whole life growing up. And so the idea of moving to another state just seemed so impossible to me. And I remember before we ever even made plans to try and do it, just thinking like, man, if I ever wanted to do this, I just can't wrap my head around how it would work job-wise and how that would even happen. And then Brittany and I, we had talked about it, and we wanted to do this, and I just couldn't figure out a way it would happen. And then, lo and behold, God made a way. He made it possible for it to happen, and we moved, and God is so faithful. And then, okay, see you later, God. Thanks. And then we got down here, and everything that we moved down here for seemed to explode right in front of our faces. And I remember crying, and we moved down here to help plant a church. That didn't end up happening, and the couple friendships we had didn't end up going forward. And I remember thinking just like, God, we are trying to be faithful. God, we need your help. And then, wouldn't you know it, he provides a way, and we're able to go and help start this other church, and we're there for 6-7 years, and it's great. And then, you know, we'll just kind of, see you later, God. I'll call you when I need you. And then other challenges come up, hard times with kids that would crying out to God, and then they get a little better, and then, okay, see you, God. And what I found is that I am really good at crying out to God when I need him. Really good at it. But I am not really good at crying out to God when I feel like things are fine. And I don't know about you, but I think that's the way a lot of us are. That it is good. It is good. It is a great thing to cry out to God in times of need. It's a good thing to ask for prayers. As we talked about, you can do so. Our elders will pray for you. And it's a good thing, and it often happens to ask for prayers for people that are struggling financially, struggling with their health, struggling with their families. And those are all good things to do. But man, sometimes the people that need the prayer the most are the people that everything's going really, really good. Because sometimes that's the hardest time to look to God. When you're down and you feel like I got nowhere else to turn, my health is not doing well, I'm struggling to afford my house, my kids aren't doing well, sometimes that's the easiest time to turn to God because you feel like there's nowhere else to go. But when things are good, I got it. I got it under control. God, I'll call you later. You know, when we moved down here to North Carolina, one of the things that I really wanted to be sure of, and I would say I've like medium succeeded, not great, but I'm trying, is I didn't want my relationship with my parents to turn into me only calling them when I needed them. You know, Dad, something's broken in our house. Can you walk me through what to do? Or I need help with something. Or calling them just for those reasons. But to call them because I actually want to talk to them and because I want to be close to them. And I found that there's been times that I did that more so than I even did that with my relationship with God. That there are times where I just call on God when I need him. But when I don't, or when I feel like I don't, I know he'll be there when I come back. I don't think about it in that way, but that's the way that we can often live, and that's the way that I often do as well. You know, it was funny. We a handful of years ago had a friend who had a brother who moved out to California, and he moved out there. He got a pretty high profile, really well paying job, and was doing better than us. He's doing really well for himself. And I remember my friend and even my friend's mom asking for prayer for him. And the prayer that they asked for was not the prayer that you would expect. You know, he was probably, I don't know, in his early to mid-20s at the time. And the prayer was not the one you'd expect of just pray for him that he'll succeed out there, he's going on his own, that he'll be able to make a go of it, that he'll be healthy, far away from home, and all these things. But their prayer for him was, you know, he's doing really well for himself. And he is succeeding. And it's going to be really easy for him to forget about God. And I remember hearing that and thinking, man, that is so true for so many of us. That it's so easy just to forget about God when things are going really, really well. But I hope and I pray that we can remember that to not live like the Israelites and only turning to God when we're in danger, only turning to God when we desperately need deliverance, but continually coming to him whether things are good or whether things are bad. See, the fact of the matter is we see this story of this landowner who sent his son to this vineyard. And the reason that he's sending his son and that he keeps sending these servants is because he expects something from this vineyard. If this was a hopeless vineyard, if it was destitute, if he didn't expect anything from it, there'd be no reason to keep sending anyone to it. But the reason that he's sending his son to it is because he expects something to come from this vineyard. And that's the reason that he sent his son for you and for me. It's because he expects something from you and from me. It's because even if you have lost hope in yourself, he has not lost hope in you. And if he did, he would not have sent his son for you. It doesn't matter what happened before today. It doesn't matter how many times we've walked away from God, in the good times or the bad. God is there being an extremely, extremely patient God, saying, I'm ready for you to come back. I'm ready for you to come back. Don't wait till the disaster. Don't wait until you feel like there's nowhere else to go, but I'm ready for you to come back now. And he's also saying, I'm ready for you to come back and to stay. To come back, but not to turn around and go as soon as things get better, as soon as you feel like you've got it under control, but to stay with me in the good times and the bad, in sickness and in health, no matter what happens, but to stay with me instead of just calling on me in the times we feel like we need him the most. So I want to take a moment and I want to pray for us. And I want to pray for myself, and I want to pray for you, and I want to pray for those of us that are really, really struggling in life right now, that where we feel like there is nowhere else to go, that we will remember there is always a place to go, and that is to Jesus. But also for those of us that feel like we've got it. I'm healthy, my kids are healthy, we've got good jobs, everything is going really well, to remember that even in the good times, we need Jesus more than ever before.